3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of government propaganda. So historically, when it comes to authoritarian rulers, the best way for a tyrant to stay in power is to convince their citizens that they are crucial to their nation's survival, and that without them, the people of their nation cannot be protected. Thus, in order to convince people of this idea, propaganda has been used all the time historically by authoritarian rulers to brainwash their citizens, believe that they are this great ruler that people just cannot live without. And this concept has remained incredibly prevalent throughout human history up to the present day even, where dictators ensure their propaganda is successful by banning all independent media and government criticism, and by trying to eliminate all democratic institutions. That way they can control the entire government and the news in their nation. Because after all, the less people know and the less laws in place to restrict an authoritarian's power in a country, the easier it is for a dictator to control society completely and basically just do whatever they want. So therefore, historically, government propaganda has been used really to accomplish two basic goals. First, make it so that the people of a nation are so brainwashed that they will allow you to do whatever you want. And second, convince people that you're basically the greatest person ever and that they cannot survive without you. So basically, just imagine the most toxic type of relationship possible with another human being. And this is the relationship that these dictators want to cultivate with the citizens that they rule over. And there are historic examples of this format being used going back thousands of years because obviously for most of human history, the societies of the world were run by dictators who would often use propaganda talking about how great they were. However, there were some dictators even in the ancient world that were making some pretty crazy propagandistic claims, even by ancient standards. For instance, about 2,200 years ago, the king of the Seleucid kingdom, Antiochus IV, gave himself the title of God Manifest. And this is a popular idea throughout human history where rulers want their people to either view them as a god or chosen by God. Because obviously, if people are really religious in your society, the idea that their ruler has some connection to God gives their ruler a lot of power over those people. Additionally, rulers have also promoted propaganda regarding ethnic nationalism and the idea that their nation is superior to other societies, which helps justify their rulers' thirst for conquest and territorial expansion. This has been used by kings and emperors for thousands of years to justify invasions. For example, about 2,000 years ago, the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar used this tactic a lot to justify conquering the various tribes in Europe. I mean, if you think about all the other people of the world as just these barbarians that deserve to be conquered and exploited, and you've convinced your society that you are the superior race of human beings, then, basically you can convince people of all sorts of crazy stuff. And we've seen this throughout history when it comes to not just the empires of the ancient world, but colonialism and imperialism, where, different empires and societies feel the need to conquer other people and basically just take over their territory for their own profit and benefit. So now, moving beyond ancient historical examples, some of the most well-known propagandist dictators in human history really come from the 20th century because you see these really destructive people that killed millions of people. Leaders like Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong of Communist China. So now just talking briefly about the various propaganda that these infamous rulers promoted. We'll start with Adolf Hitler, who ruled Nazi Germany from 1934 to 1945. And under Hitler, Germans were led to believe that Hitler was this savior and the only person capable of making Germany great again and protecting Germany from evil, especially Jews, who Hitler falsely claimed various conspiracy theories about, which were later used by Hitler to justify the Holocaust, which killed millions of Jews. Thus, Hitler removed democratic institutions and promoted himself as a leader and protector of the Aryan race, which he believed was the smartest race on the planet. Hitler also had a documentary produced to promote the power of Nazi Germany under his leadership called The Triumph of Will, and even had his army swear an oath of allegiance to him called the Führer Oath, where soldiers swore complete obedience to Hitler. On top of this, pictures of Hitler were all over the place in Nazi Germany, and people were often greeting each other with these Nazi salutes and saying Hail Hitler and all sorts of crazy stuff. Additionally, Hitler created the Hitler Youth, which was basically this education program for German boys used to brainwash them into Nazis when they turned 10 years old. And of course, also Hitler's larger-than-life cult of personality would eventually lead Hitler to starting World War II, which would eventually lead to his death after he was defeated. And next, there is Joseph Stalin, someone who actually had a fair amount in common with Adolf Hitler, despite fighting against him in World War II, since he also had this crazy personality and ruled the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953 after the death of the first dictator of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin. And under Stalin, the Soviet government promoted Stalin as this infinitely wise and great leader and a genius who was never wrong and always right. And this led him to get away with basically anything he wanted, like taking government actions that led to millions of Ukrainians starving to death due to his socialist policies, which entailed confiscating lots of private farmland from Ukrainian peasants, as well as his execution and imprisonment of millions of Russians that he feared were disloyal to him, mostly due to his massive paranoia. In fact, there was such a strong culture of 100% obedience out of fear under Joseph Stalin that Russians under his rule were encouraged to even report each other for being disloyal to the government, so the government could get rid of the undesirables in society. Additionally, Stalin also had statues and images of himself everywhere in the Soviet Union, and even had the phrase, "Thank you, dear comrade Stalin, for a happy childhood," being shown off at all the different schools in the Soviet Union. And like all other dictatorships in the age of mass media, the Soviet government controlled the media completely, which was, of course, just an echo chamber of constant praise for Stalin. And furthermore, Stalin also had a Russian city named after himself, which became known as Stalingrad, and even had his name become part of the Soviet national anthem. So next, turning to Mao Zedong, who ruled China after the Communist Revolution from 1949 to 1976. Under his rule, like in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Mao was praised as a glorious leader that could do no wrong, and of course government criticism was illegal, and anyone deemed disloyal would be imprisoned or killed. In fact, under Mao Zedong's oppression and socialist government policies, which, like Stalin, took away private property and farmland, a huge famine in China occurred, killing millions of Chinese. In addition, as the ruler of China, Mao's propaganda included things like the distribution of what was called the Little Red Book, which was basically this book filled with various quotes from Mao Zedong that many citizens carried in order to show their loyalty to him. And on top of this, Mao Zedong also had special Mao Zedong badges created for the same purpose that would be given out to people, so they can proudly wear them and show that, hey, I blindly support my leader who is glorious and perfect, etc., etc. And of course, like other dictatorships from the 20th century, Mao Zedong's pictures and statues were all over the country, and there was even a loyalty dance to Mao Zedong. So these are three pretty crazy and sadistic dictators from history that all killed millions of people. And before I get into some of the personality cults of rulers currently in power today, there are a couple others I would like to mention who ruled in recent years that were also these stereotypical ultra-authoritarian rulers who claimed, the traditional nonsense of how great they were. but also had some comically dumb and unique claims that were pretty wild as well that I think deserve some mentioning. So, for instance, this is a ruler that is not terribly well known historically, but the former ruler of the country Turkmenistan, who ruled from 1985 to 2006, Saparmurat Niyazov, did some pretty crazy things as the ruler of Turkmenistan. For example, he wrote a semi-autobiographical book about himself, which was, get this, used as the primary educational textbook at all levels of education in Turkmenistan, and for whatever reason was even used for the driver's license exam, which I must say, yeah, you have to give him credit for the creativity there. Not many dictators have that much influence over the driver's license exam in their countries, so that's pretty special there. And besides this, he also renamed days of the week, months of the year, and even a crater on the moon after himself. So though that's pretty hard to top in terms of kookiness, the other honorable mention that I'd like to point out is the former North Korean ruler Kim Jong-il, who ruled North Korea from 1994 to 2011 and made the following absurd claims. For example, he claimed that the first time that he ever played golf, he had 11 hole-in-ones. He also claimed to walk at 3 weeks old. He also claimed to write over 1,500 books in just 3 years, as well as 6 operas, which, by the way, apparently his operas, according to the North Korean government, are considered to be the greatest music of all time. And lastly, he also claimed to be a global fashion icon. And though you would think that's enough in terms of just how great a person can claim to be, however, just to top it all off, just as the sort of the cherry on top of this, in a truly superhuman feat, he also claimed that he never had to go to the bathroom. So, boom. You have to give him some creativity points for that. Now, as for the modern world today, probably the big three when it comes to dictators that promote propaganda around the world would be the president of China, Xi Jinping, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and what is called the supreme leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So starting off with the son of Kim Jong-il, we have Kim Jong-un, who has ruled North Korea since 2011. And just like his dad, he promotes himself as the greatest person ever and allows no government criticism, and any perceived political opposition is either executed or imprisoned in traditional North Korean fashion. Additionally, he consistently obsesses over having nuclear weapons and loves to threaten nuclear war and the destruction of other nations, especially democracies around the world, which he constantly deems evil in the North Korean government-owned media. Moreover, there are many songs written in honor of him, and he also claimed North Korea had no cases of COVID-19, which would be pretty incredible given the fact that the whole world has reported many, many cases. But that's the North Korean propaganda there. So, kind of following in his father's footsteps, but clearly he has a long way to go to top the legacy of his father when it comes to outrageous propaganda. And next we have the president of China, Xi Jinping, who has ruled China since 2013. And under his rule, he has removed presidential term limits and promoted himself as this incredible leader. And of course, in traditional fashion, government criticism is not tolerated and you'll get imprisoned for it. On top of this, he also has pictures of himself all over China and has even created his own political ideology called Xi Jinping Thought, which is taught all over Chinese schools and is also part of the Chinese Constitution. Furthermore, he is currently persecuting Tibetans and the Uyghur populations in China by forcing them into re-education in labor camps, which the Chinese government propaganda promotes as a form of useful education for the betterment of society by stripping away these people's cultural identities by force. Also, the Chinese government regularly promotes ultra-patriotic revisionist history of various historical events in China, which is, I will say, very common in dictatorships around the world, but more noticeable today as history is shared more and more globally. And he's also promoted this type of propaganda at different universities around the world via China's Confucius Institutes, which exist all over in various countries, including countries in Europe and the US. And lastly, the Chinese government-controlled media also consistently promotes propaganda against various democratic nations around the world and how bad they are compared to China. And finally, we have the most noble propagandist ruler today, given the recent events in Ukraine, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is currently waging genocide against Ukraine. And Putin has ruled Russia since 2000 and has since criminalized any government criticism and removed presidential term limits. This is the classic moves for complete authoritarian control over a nation. Additionally, government-controlled media frequently promotes Putin as this glorious Russian hero, and the typical authoritarian dictator-type propaganda about how evil Western democracies around the world are. Additionally, he has his own youth group in Russia, which actively promotes Russian government propaganda, somewhat similar to Hitler Youth. And this group has even published a book of quotes by Vladimir Putin called Words That Changed the World, which is somewhat similar to what Mao Zedong did in China with his Little Red Book. And on top of this, the Russian government under Putin actively encourages Russians to spy on each other and report those who are disloyal to the government authorities, especially now with what's going on in Ukraine. So this is very similar to what Stalin did in the Soviet Union. And this has really started to increase today, given how sensitive the special military operation that the Russian government calls it is right now, because the Russian government does not want to look weak and doesn't want to look like they're having issues there, despite it being obvious that there are many problems that have gone on with their special military operation. And to make matters worse, the Russian government also continues to promote the propaganda that this special military operation is to fight a mythical Ukrainian Nazi government supported by NATO, which they also falsely claim to be committing genocide against Russian speakers. And what's especially twisted about this propaganda is that they're literally doing the exact opposite. They're claiming that genocide is being committed against Russian speakers while they're actively themselves committing genocide against Ukraine. In terms of insane propaganda, this is probably one of the craziest you'll ever see in history. And unfortunately, this is happening right now as you listen to this. Lastly, on a little bit of a lighter note, Putin also loves to promote himself as this very masculine and cool guy, whether it is by comically riding a horse with no shirt on and sunglasses, despite not exactly having, the physique of an athlete or some male model. But perhaps even funnier has been his attempts at playing hockey. For instance, recently, within the last few years, he played in a hockey game with former Russian hockey stars, and by some miracle managed to score 8 goals, despite, based on the video, it being pretty evident he was not the most skilled hockey player in the world, and he was quite a slow skater. And in fact, if you watch the video footage on YouTube or something of him playing, you can clearly see the goalie literally just letting him score over and over again and physically getting out of the way. And then later in this same video clip of him playing, after scoring a goal and celebrating, he was skating along the ice and giving high fives to other players on his team and wasn't paying attention and ended up tripping face first on a carpet that was left on the ice. So overall, that was a pretty impressive performance there. But anyway, at the end of the day, all these dictators throughout history seem to have in common this childlike obsession with manufacturing propaganda that is all about supporting their own ego. And they really are just like these insecure children that are so desperate for attention that they constantly just have to make up all these crazy lies. And part of it's just because they get so wrapped up in these fantasy worlds that they create for themselves, so much so that they start to even believe the fantasies that they've created. They start to believe the propaganda that they've created. And over time, in classic dictator fashion, a lot of these people also remove anyone from their inner circle who doesn't really just go along with whatever they say and tell them everything they want to hear, which makes these authoritarian governments ultimately weaker and more fragile. And despite these sometimes comical claims made by these dictators historically, which are often, quite frankly, embarrassingly dumb, we unfortunately have had millions and millions of people die due to these dictators throughout history, and this trend of dictator-caused violence only continues, which is really sad because it is always a societal failure on the domestic level and the international level when a person is allowed to commit such atrocities. And it ultimately just goes to show what happens when a person's greed, lack of education, and a lack of democratic values fuse together in a person that develops absolute power over a nation, which can then give birth to a dictator, a person who very well could have had a different life if their experiences were slightly different or if someone would have stepped up to prevent them getting in that position in the first place. And that's the sad thing about all this, is because every time a dictator comes to power is something that could have been prevented. And once they are in control, once they have stripped away the democratic values of a nation, if there were democratic values in the first place, sometimes they just inherit this authority. But even then, they can still strip away the different sort of harnesses on their power by getting rid of people that, are not loyal to them blindly. And once they have control over an entire nation, they can just use this overwhelming propaganda campaign to brainwash their populace. And for those people that they cannot brainwash, they'll simply just get rid of, which will make it so even if there is resistance in the nation, the resistance will be so afraid that they won't say anything. In turn, you get a society where the majority of people will blindly support these dictators in everything they say or do, because so many of these people are so uneducated and they've never had any experiences in a free society that they are incredibly easy to brainwash and will worship their dictators as if they're a god because they don't know any better. And we're seeing this right now, for example, in Russia today. Most Russians support the Russian government and everything it's doing in Ukraine because most people don't actually know what's going on. They just hear whatever their government tells them, which is that they're saving the world, basically. And despite this, there are many Russians who don't support what the Russian government is doing and have spent time outside of the country and are aware of what's actually happening. The majority of the population still just isn't aware, though. However, though, when you think about the different dictators throughout human history, like all mortal humans, dictators won't last forever. And so though it's sad to see, dictators continue to rise generation after generation, it's not permanent and it's not hopeless. And eventually their fantasy worlds will fall apart, just like every other dictators in history. Because history reminds us time and time again, as Johnny Cash said, sooner or later God's going to cut you down. Either due to these dictators making huge mistakes, which get their nation's economies severely damaged, which will significantly decrease the standard of living, whether by waging wars or other things, and thus doing things that have devastating economic consequences for your society, or getting lots of people in your society needlessly killed. This can cause major regime-threatening problems for dictators. For instance, maybe the majority of a society will rise up against their dictator, or a member of the government in the inner circle of a dictator will try to overthrow them, or perhaps the military will try to overthrow them. Alternatively, though, even if a dictator is never overthrown, they eventually will just get too old and they will eventually just pass away because they can't live forever. And of course, once they are gone, their society will eventually know more of the truth about the various lies these dictators promoted, because the mask of lies that these dictators wear will one day come off. And the people they ruled will eventually learn more of the truth. Because things change once a ruler is gone, and future leaders don't necessarily care as much about the reputation of past leaders, since they are often more focused on their own reputations and preserving their own power. Because this doesn't mean necessarily that once a dictator is gone, that this society will become free magically. At the end of the day, that is up to the people of a nation collectively to decide to create a democratic and free society. Because if the people cannot get together collectively and agree and work together and believe that democracy is possible, simply a new dictator will emerge and history will just repeat again and again and again. Thus, as long as dictators rule nations in the world, a peaceful world cannot be achieved. Because like an addicted gambler, many dictators just want more and more power and influence in the world, which often can lead them to waging wars. Which is why, as a global human society, we must continue to protect democracies and promote democratic values as best we can, so that one day we can have a world without wars and we can all be free. Right now, that seems like a pipe dream, unfortunately, but it doesn't always have to be. All of human history is about us overcoming and building brighter futures and trying to overcome. It's in our DNA. It's what we do. It's always incredibly hard to imagine the world changing when you're living in it. But from generation to generation, the world changes drastically. And who's to say it cannot move drastically towards a freer and more democratic world without constant warfare popping up? The choice will always be ours as a collective global society. So with that, as always, remember, billions of years led to you. So make the most of it.